Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure. As I was telling Teresa, I'm from Western North Carolina, so it's always nice to get back into whatever mountains I can get to. Okay, yeah, so I'm the Assistant Director of Native American Studies at UGA. I'm also a historian. And in the Institute at UGA, when I first started in 2021, the first thing that got assigned to me was to start working on land. I didn't have a lot of experience with land acknowledgements. So the first thing I did was contacted the Department of the Interior, who, for the first time in US history, we have a Native American who is the Secretary of the Interior. And they immediately instituted a program to help institutions write land acknowledgements. So I took a workshop with 3 Indigenous women about land acknowledgements, what they're for, what they can and can't do, what they shouldn't be about, and what they should accomplish. I was a little surprised to learn that even Native people were like, it's just words. A land acknowledgement is just words. But it can accomplish something if it's done correctly. And so what I want to talk about today is really the work that went into designing our land acknowledgements and the work that needs to be done for any institution to write an effective land acknowledgement. I also should point out that a land acknowledgement can include a labor acknowledgement referencing the history of slavery in places like Georgia. At UGA, we have another group in African American Studies who are working on the labor acknowledgement. I simply focused on the land aspect. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. But I want to be clear that there's more that can be done with a statement like this than just an Indigenous land acknowledgement. Still, the land acknowledgement is really, I think, the crucial basis of a statement like this. So first, as a historian, it is important to understand the history of the United States concerning Native American policy. Thought I closed my email. Anyway, really there are 6 main eras of Indian policy, and all of them prior to 1960 were designed to destroy Native American culture. Regardless of names like coexistence, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson weren't exactly trying to coexist with natives. They just didn't have the power to remove them. So this history really should be understood before you dig into writing a land acknowledgement, because depending on when your place became part of the United States, these federal laws apply to that place and how it was made federal land. If you do not acknowledge that in the land acknowledgement, you have skipped a fundamental step. So Dahlonega becomes part of the United States technically in 1835. Not until then. Dahlonega, we'll talk about the name in a minute, what the name means, and what a lot of Cherokee people think it's really about. But this spot in particular has a really strange history because according to state law, it became a part of the state of Georgia before it was legally federal land. That is unusual, even in the eastern United States, and it's important to understand that. So for a place like Dahlonega, especially University of North Georgia, the history is really unique. And if you don't dig into the specific history of this piece of land, you're likely going to miss something. And I can promise you that Native peoples are aware of this history. And they will be able to look at your land acknowledgement statement and say, you've missed something. So it is important to understand US Indian policy and the history of your institution. Out west, land acknowledgements will look very different than they do in the eastern United States, especially in states like California or Washington State, where there are dozens or in the case of Washington State, I think 22 federally recognized tribes. It is much easier in a place like Washington to contact a tribal citizen or a tribal group and say, hey, can you help us develop a land acknowledgement statement? It's not so easy in Georgia. The nearest tribe is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. They have a tribal historic preservation office who will happily help you, and I can share information about contacting Miranda Panther if anyone is interested to get some consultation with the Eastern Band. But caveat to that is they have 6 people working in the tribal historic preservation office, and they do everything from NAGPRA compliance, protecting native sites, and things like land acknowledgements, which often don't make it to the top of their to-do list. Still, it is important to consult with tribes. In the West, that's much easier. And the history can also be so different. California has a pretty brutal history. Slavery was outlawed in California, so they just enslaved natives. The main strip in Los Angeles was initially a slave market where Native Americans were sold. And so Western land acknowledgements, especially in California, have to acknowledge that history as well. It's different here, but it's also more complicated, and it's not as easy to just contact tribal members and ask them what they think of your statements. This is our land acknowledgement. I'm going to skip it for right now. I'm going to come back to that later. That'll be the very last thing that I do while reading our land. These are the 2 women that I took a workshop with. There's a different group doing the workshops this year. They're free. You just have to register through the Department of Interior. I think they do them twice a year. The one I was in, I think there were like 600 and something Zoom attending. It was immensely enlightening and set us on a path towards developing what I think is an effective statement. I can happily share this information. It's also important to understand the relationship between tribes and the federal government if you're going to write an effective land. There are 2 bits of the Constitution, including the 10th Amendment, that actually set up a very distinct relationship between tribes and the federal government. Tribes do not get special treatment. I really get frustrated when people ask me, why do tribes get special treatment in America? That is not the case. Tribes were sovereign nations before the United States existed. The United States acknowledged the sovereignty of those groups through treaties, through the Constitution, through the Indian Intercourse Acts of 1790 and 1816. Tribes are separate nations with sovereign governments that are considered domestic dependent nations. They can establish their own laws and their own constitutions as long as they do not conflict with the US Constitution. It is not special treatment. They have a legal status that is unique in the United States. And there are 574 tribal governments in the US, way more than there are states. Understanding this relationship between the federal government and tribes will help you understand what a land acknowledgement should do. States and state governments legally have 0 authority over tribes unless some arrangement has been made through the federal government. That's not an issue that we have to worry about in Georgia. There are no federally recognized tribes. There are 3 state-recognized tribes, and most federally recognized tribes consider those tribes to be fraudulent or whatever. I'm not going to get into those issues. But from my experience, it is best to deal with federally recognized tribes if you're getting your land acknowledgement, getting consultation on your thing. They have a level of authority on these issues that is much more easy to justify if you're dealing with federal tribes. Again, a whole other set of political issues that is beyond the scope of this talk. Some graph shows the Native American population. You can't see the dates, but 1900 is right about here. The nadir of Native American populations in the US was around the 1900 census. But that too is also complicated. Not only were tribes devastated by disease, by warfare, by imprisonment, by fleeing to other nations like Canada and Mexico. By 1900, it was also maybe not the best thing to identify as a Native American. So many people on the census who were Native probably did not acknowledge it. All that plays into these population numbers. But again, if you think about the history of US expansion, it parallels this decline in Native populations. And since the 1920s, there has been a steady rise in tribal populations. We're somewhere over 3 million Native American citizens, as in they are citizens of federally recognized tribes. That's still a tiny proportion of the US population. So it's important to understand that when you're writing one of these land acknowledgements, you are talking to living people. These are not people of the past. They are survivors of this history, and they are very resilient, and their cultures still exist, and they are thriving today. After 1961, the US enacted policies that the historians call the self-determination policy era. It took a long time for that to really be what was happening, and tribes now do have a level of self-determination in their leadership and in their lives that they have never had in US history before. At the same time, it is important to understand that really Native children growing up today, Native college students of college student age, are the first generation to grow up with actual effective self-determination policies in their reservation. That has made a huge difference, and things are speeding up in terms of the expansion of tribal self-determination. So, to get to the specific history of Dahlonega, I have some questions. These are not my questions. But there are two things really that a land acknowledgement must do if it's effective. First off, it should simply make the hearers of this acknowledgement aware of the tribes that used to be the caretakers of the land that the institution is on. Secondly, and most importantly, the real purpose is to create a safe space where natives feel like they are being invited into a conversation about the land. That is really all a land acknowledgement can do. If your land acknowledgement does not make it obvious that you want to have a conversation about the land your institution is on with Native peoples, then it is not an effective land acknowledgement. That should be the real goal of a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements do not, I've had these questions asked, so let me try to go through them. They do not establish legal grounds for tribes to claim land back at all. I've had people in one of the colleges at UGA say, but if we write a land acknowledgement, then won't the Cherokee just come take the land back? No. A land acknowledgement establishes no legal grounds for any such thing, and no tribes have ever tried to do any such. I suppose I can understand those concerns, maybe, but that's just not an issue. A land acknowledgement is really just starting a conversation, and that is all. So you want to ask, when you're writing a land acknowledgement, who are the indigenous people who are on the land? Do their descendants still exist? And do their descendants still have a relationship to them? Here, the answer is absolutely yes, the Cherokee still exist, and absolutely yes, they do sustain relationships to the Chestatee River Valley. I have taken some tribal elders from Oklahoma on a tour of Western North Carolina, and I was amazed and inspired by the fact that some of these people who were in their 80s who had never been to North Carolina, I took them to Judah Rock. They got out of the van and immediately in Cherokee started telling stories about the place. They had heard stories all their lives about places they had never been to. And as soon as they saw the place, they recognized it and they began sharing the stories about the place. That is a long-term relationship to this land. And I am certain that there are very similar stories being shared in the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma and in the Eastern Band about this river valley. Those relationships are still very much alive, and tribal citizens are generally much more aware of the history of places like this than the people who moved in after the natives were forced out. As a descendant of some of these colonizers, I think it's important to acknowledge I am not a native. I have probably some native heritage, but I did not inherit any native culture, and so I would never claim any native heritage. I think it is very important to acknowledge that reality. I get myself in trouble by that. It's also, I think, not inappropriate for me to be doing this because tribal citizens shouldn't always be the ones doing this work of educating non-natives about what a land acknowledgement is. Do you know what Dahlonega means? It means the yellow place. And it doesn't have the usual Cherokee ending EE of an important place. If it was the important yellow place, it would be Dahlonega. Dahlonega just means a place that's yellow. Many Cherokees think it's kind of a joke, because when gold was discovered here in 1828, white prospectors went nuts and flooded into this river valley. And lots of Cherokee people think the name Dahlonega is really like, oh, Dahlonega, the place where white people go crazy about the yellow stuff. Get myself in trouble. I'm not hurting anybody's feelings, but lots of Cherokee people think the name of this town is really a joke about the gold rush, which kind of fits with Cherokee. By 1828, the Cherokee Nation, which used to encompass all this land within the red border there, had shrunk to what's in this gold border. Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, North Georgia, a little bit of Alabama. Dahlonega is basically sort of inside the edge there. I didn't bring my laser pointer, but you all know where you are. It was in the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee people by 1828 were moving out of this region because so many white settlers were moving in illegally under federal law. But several things happened. And one of the things that we're doing at Athens is trying to make people more aware of the government of Georgia's direct involvement in Indian removal. So I'm going to do a little rundown of some important Georgia laws. In 1802, Abraham Baldwin, the first president of UGA, made an agreement with Thomas Jefferson called the Georgia Compact of 1802. In that agreement, he says, All right, Thomas, we will cede all of our western claims. Georgia used to go all the way to the Mississippi. We will cede everything to the federal government west of the Flint River. That's all of Alabama and Mississippi. In exchange for the federal government agreeing to remove the Indians from the state of Georgia as soon as possible. That was in 1802. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson moves forward with the unconstitutional Louisiana Purchase. He doubles the size of the United States, and he writes Abraham Baldwin and his friend Wilson Lumpkin and says, all right, now we've got a place to remove Indians to. We can start moving forward with the plan from your compact of 1802. That's 1803, 27 years before the Indian Removal Act. In 1805, Georgia institutes their first land lottery. This is kind of unique. Most states didn't give out land this way. Georgia did it against federal law. They surveyed plots of land. They got settlers to put their name in a hat. They drew your name, they assigned you a plot of land, and you could go move there. Most of that land was given away in a land lottery before it was ever ceded to the United States. It was still legally Creek and Cherokee land. So the first land lottery is in 1850. I mean, I was right. 1806. They pass another land lottery act. They have another land lottery in 1807. In 1807, almost all the land given out in the land lottery was claimed by the Creeks. In 1818, they have a third land lottery. In 1819, the federal government passes something called the Civilization Fund Act, which gave money to groups that wanted to civilize Indians. That is a whole other talk just about this idea of civilizing Indians. We know of them as the 5 civilized tribes because this process was enacted on them. Most of this federal money went to missionary organizations who established boarding schools. And in those boarding schools, they began the practice of cutting hair, removing tribal clothing, banning tribal languages. All of these things happened in Georgia. It didn't necessarily start here, but with the land lottery and the forced civilization of tribal children, Georgia was complicit, absolutely. In 1820 and in 1821, Creek and Cherokee lands were given out in continuing land lotteries. Those lands had been ceded to the Cherokees and Creeks through US treaties, and the government of Georgia just ignored those federal laws. It says in the Constitution that treaties with foreign nations, including Indians, should be the supreme law of the land. The government of Georgia of the 19th century. 1822, Congress abolished standing trade policies with tribal nations. Partially because of the votes of the 2 senators from Georgia, who wanted to do everything they could to get rid of tribal title to lands in Georgia. The government of Georgia and the Senate and the House of Representatives commonly worked together to take title, remove the legal title that Cherokees and Creeks had to land in Georgia through treaties with the United States. In 1823, Congress spends $30,000 extinguishing tribal title to lands just in Georgia. They also did this in Ohio and Illinois, but the practice starts in Georgia. They're basically finding legal loopholes to take back land that they had promised to Creeks and Cherokees in perpetuity. This is the language of the treaty. 1825, we have our 5th land lottery in the state of Georgia. By 1827, all creek lands in Georgia had basically been either taken back or given out in land lotteries. So the creeks, this sort of green strip there on the left was the last sort of bit of their land, and almost all of that is given out between 1824 and 1827. Georgia annuls Cherokee law in 1827, says that the Cherokee Nation laws do not apply in Georgia, and they extend the laws of the state illegally over an independent sovereign nation within the bounds of their state. They make it illegal after gold is discovered for Cherokees to pan or mine for gold on their own land. They had to apply for permission from the state government. The state government was never going to give a Native American permission to dig gold in their own land. 1828, Cherokees are again stripped of a layer of rights. They are not allowed to represent themselves in court, and they are not allowed to testify against a white person in the courts. Think about what this means. An independent sovereign nation has their rights taken away within a certain part of their nation, the largest part in the Northeast Georgia. Here they are stripped of all their rights to court representation. They can't pan for gold. They've already moved as far away from Dahlonega as they could afford to get because so many prospectors and settlers were moving in here. And I'm sure many of you have been to the Gold Museum over there. It started off really violent. After these land lotteries are put in place, legally, the people who received this land were supposed to wait until the Cherokee left this land. But what actually happens is that small groups of heavily armed men, gangs, and militias come in and run the Cherokee out of places like the Chestatee River. That is happening in the late 1820s before the Indian Removal Act. And in fact, that violence became one of Andrew Jackson's justification for passing the Indian Removal Act. Well, there's so much violence happening that we've really got to protect our citizens and the Indians. So we should just move them west of the Mississippi. The state of Georgia has been working on this for 30 years already. We should just go ahead and do it. Andrew Jackson does some relatively shady things to get the Indian Removal Act passed. There was massive resistance from the public in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and it is passed by only 5 votes in the Senate. 5 individuals said, okay, let's go ahead. And that made all the difference and led to one of the darkest points in US history. 1830, the Indian Removal Act and the 6th land lottery, which included gold plots in this river valley. The lottery was usually free, but to get a gold plot, you had to pay a $10 fee. And then the gold plots were drawn out of a separate hat with your name in it. The original settlers of Dahlonega were the winners of these gold plots. Hope nobody's family is going to. The 7th land lottery in 1833, I do know how to spell lottery. Gave off what was left of Cherokee land, basically. The plots that nobody wanted, the plots that didn't have gold, the weird shaped plots in between bigger plots, they were given out in another land lottery in 1833. These are the major sites where gold was found. Most of the gold was found in tributaries to the Chestatee. Only one major site was outside the Cherokee Nation. By 1835, when the some Cherokees are coerced into signing a removal treaty, and they were not authorized to sign any treaties, the Ridges That leads to Indian removal. I'm suspecting that many of you are familiar with the general story of Indian removal. It happened here. Although actually it didn't happen so much here because by 1835, there were no Cherokees living close to here because they had already either been murdered or violently run out of their homes. And that's not just Dahlonega, I'm not just singling out. But it really starts here because of the gold that just speeds up this process. I think it probably would have taken a little bit longer to get the Cherokees to sign an illegal removal treaty if it hadn't been so violent in the Eastern Cherokee Nation and around this part of the mountains. There is no way that you could write a land acknowledgement statement that includes all that. You just can't. It's a land acknowledgement pamphlet at that point. And one of the things about an effective land acknowledgement is brevity. It needs to be pretty short. You can't tell this whole story, but you need to have language in there that acknowledges this reality. You cannot shy away from the reality. Although I know from experience you have to balance this with political reasoning. UGA has yet to accept or adopt our land acknowledgement statement. Our strategy is to get programs and departments to adopt it with the hope, and the Student Senate, who has just adopted it last week. Once that happens, then maybe we can get some pressure on upper administration to adopt a land acknowledgement statement. One of the things that's really important, because you can't tell a huge, complicated story like this, is to just consider what this story means for tribal people. Native Americans, Cherokees, Creeks, Uchis, possibly some Catawba people, groups that we have probably never heard of and will never know about, lived on this land for thousands of years. The oldest archaeological evidence of human habitation in this part of the world is from almost 15,000 years ago. The United States has existed for what, 245 years? Compared to 15,000 years. That's a long time. And there's evidence everywhere. I'm sure many of you have seen evidence of that long-term habitation of this place. Those cultures grew, were created, and thrived on this land. And they were handed down through oral tradition, through song, through storytelling that's more than just stories for children on this land. Those stories are about this land. They're about the plants and the animals and the rivers and the mountains of this land. And that had been true for 10,000 years in 1828. The violence that begins in this region and results in the total expulsion of Cherokees from the state of Georgia was immensely disruptive to this 10,000-year-long knowledge system. But it did not destroy it. There are people in Oklahoma who know stories about this river valley that none of us have ever heard. There are people in Western North Carolina who know things about this river valley that none of us may ever know. You have to acknowledge that. That is also a part of this story, and I think that's the place to start. By acknowledging that the surviving descendants of these people who were violently removed from this place still have knowledge and relationships to this place. That is how you start a conversation with natives. You don't have to go through all the details I just mentioned, but you need to know them. And that needs to be behind the simple statement that you write to acknowledge that relationship to the land. So I've got the heritage cycle here. This is a sociology thing, but I'm sure some of you may have seen this, right? Cultural revitalization, again, we are just in the first complete generation of Native American young people in the United States who have been able to grow up almost entirely in their culture. There are more Cherokee speakers in the United States now than there have been in 200 years, because there's a language immersion school in North Carolina and in Oklahoma. They grow up now in those schools. English is not allowed. There's a big sign at the Eastern Bend school that says English stops here. And everything in the school is written in Cherokee, spoken in Cherokee, except in algebra where they're using some Arabic, because algebra is an Arabic technology. They are not teaching anything in English. They don't need to, because those kids learn English when they step outside the school. This is the first generation, really, right now, stepping into leadership roles in tribal governments that have been able to grow up in their own culture, really. And that's what this heritage cycle is really all about. It's about creating value in your own culture instead of instilling shame about your own culture, which has been the process of most of American history prior to this generation. That is what you really need to acknowledge. You need to know the history, but you need to acknowledge the depth of damage that that history has done to Native peoples. The focus needs to be on the Native people, and you need to talk to them about it. They know this history. You don't need to tell them the history. Just to step back again, this is all federal legislation. Those that are in red were actually intended to terminate tribal governments. Termination is the name of that policy era, and it was the intent of the federal government to just get rid of tribal sovereignty altogether, and they couldn't do it. It was too complicated. They got rid of 16 tribes. And I think 2 of those tribes have since been recognized again. There are still 574 tribal governments. They tried to terminate them federally and couldn't make it happen. So in 1961 is the beginning of self-determination. And everything since 1961 has really been a stepping stone towards this era of effective self-determination that we're really just in the first generation. That should just give you a sense of how difficult this really is. And you need to fit a land acknowledgement statement into all of this. You need to consider what all these things mean. Maybe some of you are familiar with the acronym MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And there's an acronym for something like that. It's a much bigger problem than an acronym would lead us to believe. Native women are 19 times more likely to experience sexual violence or kidnapping than other women in the United States. And other women in the United States are at greater threat than many other places. So that's a terrifying set of statistics. That's no accident either, because this history of the treatment of natives has really bore down on women in a very special kind of way. You need to understand all those things. You can't boil it down to a simple statement, but it needs to be behind the statement. So this is our land acknowledgement statement. I want to say a little bit about our process, and then I think I'll have time for questions. So in the fall of 2021, we have a 7-member steering committee at the Institute of Native American Studies. 2 of our faculty are Native. We only have 6 Native American faculty members at UGA. There are 3,000 faculty. As far as we can tell, there are less than 50 Native American students out of a 40,000 member student body. The reason that there are so few natives in Georgia is because people in Oklahoma, people in Western states, they grow up, Native people, knowing this history. They do not want to come to Georgia. We are trying to change that. And that was really one of the motivators for writing a land acknowledgement. If we want to attract Native students, we need to be having conversations with Native people. And a land acknowledgement is a good way to do that. So we drafted this. We conferred with several indigenous communities, the Porch Creeks in Alabama, the Eastern Band of Cherokee, the Seminoles. We talked to the Muscogee Nation. We talked to the Cherokee Nation. We've talked to the Wichita affiliated tribes, citizens there. We've talked to as many groups as we can. We've also talked to our Native American Student Association, which actually just formed at the time that we were working on this. It was amazing to me that UGA had never had a Native American student organization. 2021. It seems like this is all old history, right? But it's not at all. It is very much still alive. Over the span of 11 months, this went through, I think, about 9 drafts. Every time we sent it to someone, they had a different suggestion. Or they would point out, this historical thing happened, and it doesn't seem like your statement really is able to encompass this issue. It took 11 months for us to finally get to this draft. The University of Georgia is located on the traditional ancestral territory of Muscogee-speaking and Cherokee peoples, as well as other Native communities who were forcibly removed from their homelands. The lands occupied by the university throughout the state were the places of lived relationships, learning, ceremony, and resistance. We recognize these Native peoples as the original caretakers who continue to pass on their histories and traditions, sustaining connections to their ancestral land and water. This has been deemed our most effective statement. It's short. It's complicated. It should raise more questions than it provides answers. And that is why it is the way it is, because it is for initiating conversation. It is not, a land acknowledgement is not Native people welcoming you. And it's not necessarily a good idea to just reach out to a Native person and say, hey, can you come get the land acknowledgement? Because they're going to say, what kind of land acknowledgement do you have? How do you understand the point and purpose of a land acknowledgement? A land acknowledgement is not a welcome. And it is not necessarily even for us. It is for us to initiate a conversation with Native communities. And if your land acknowledgement is not doing that, then it is not effective. So I'll stop there.
About 10, or no, sorry, about 10 minutes.
Yes.
Do you think that there is value in an institution, in addition to having a land acknowledgement statement, having a dedicated space, a virtual space, let's say, right?
Right.
Where you can unpack more complex things to
Yeah.
some extent, because you can't.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely some value to that, especially an online space where people can ask questions, where Native people can ask questions, where people in the neighborhood can ask questions. I think there is a lot of value to that. The more that these issues are in conversation, the more awareness there will be, and the more a land acknowledgement will make sense. There's so much backlash against things like a land acknowledgement, which just seems so ridiculous. It's just a statement of reality. But maybe that's not what people are interested in. I think there is immense value in a space like that. And we sort of, the institute at UGA sort of serves as a space. And I in particular do a lot of outreach. I've done a very similar talk for almost every department on campus. Because we are getting pushed back from upper administration. And I've been told that a lot of this pushback is coming from the border regions. Also being yeah. I hear y'all are working on a land acknowledgement. How's that going?
It's going, so to begin, I'm
Right.
class
Right.
and my students are starting the drafts
Right.
as a.
Yeah, right.
And I think that, do you think that what we've been doing, did you hear echoes?
For sure. I mean,
Okay, good.
yeah,
I'm glad.
The thing that you said that I think really echoes with what, we've been discussing is that this isn't like the end of everything. It's not,
Yeah.
We're putting this out there and now, we're done.
Yeah.
It's really, okay, this is us opening that door. This is the start.
Yeah.
It's not the final note.
Yeah.
Even though plaques are going up with stuff on it that makes it seem very final.
Right, and that's really the only attitude to have to start with, because this is work, it's real work, and it should be taken seriously. And I have seen a lot of situations where it really just isn't, where it's like, okay, well, let's look at the map online and find out what tribe used to be here, and then we'll say that they used to be here, and that's it. That's not the point, and that does absolutely nothing. And in fact, it just continues the same sorts of things that have always been done. So yeah. And I'm happy to share any of this information with y'all.
You mentioned that UGA just recently issued their first Native American.
Yeah, in 2021.
We also do here.
Right.
Do you have any like how to challenge
We were lucky to have a couple of Native students who were really engaged in tracking down the other Natives. So, and I think that's kind of a necessary part of it. If you have Native students who are interested, then the best you can really do is support them. But at this point, I look at, they're called the Native American Student Association, NASA. And so NASA and the Institute of Native American Studies, I view it as a partnership. We've been able to accomplish what we've accomplished at UGA in the past couple of years because of the students. And of course, if UNG is anything like UGA, if students get upset about something, then administration pays. We're hoping to sort of expand the adoption of this land acknowledgement. But right now it's just at the different colleges and program level. It's tough to organize around Native issues if you don't have a core group of Native students involved. And it can also be tough to even determine how many Native students there are in this body. Self-reporting is not reliable. We know that we have something like almost 200 self-reporting Native Americans, but 46 seem to be tribally. That gets into issues of enrollment, federal recognition, state recognition, and other complicated things. But yeah, it's it's tough, and I think in a certain sense, we've been lucky. I mean, it's a tiny, 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 tiny little drop of students at UGA have made a massive difference in the visibility of Native heritage. Right, I answered that question.
I'm not sure that it's, I would just like to, hear your opinion, maybe. I feel like the times that I've heard about land acknowledgements have been when I've been sitting in a audience and a conference is starting.
Mhm.
And they do the land acknowledgement in sort of what I feel is this very sort of trite way, and then we move on with the business of the conference.
Mhm.
And I just, it seems so weird to me, and almost started to happen more after, you know, the DI.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, when you say it's not a welcome, right? And then I feel like the only times I've heard it
Yeah, it's been.
are when people are being welcomed to an opening of a celebration that really is far removed from what they're saying.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that's tough. I agree, absolutely. And it's very different by region, and we're in the southeast, which has a particularly violent history of removal. And I think in a place like where we are, it's much more common to just say like, all right, the Cherokee were here, moving on. It's treated like a welcome thing, and it's often like, let's invite a native person so they can welcome us to the land that we took from. That doesn't really make sense. And a lot of tribal people would absolutely refuse to do that. Of course, in Western states, it's very different because it can function much more like a welcome, because a lot of tribes do still own the land that is, say, Eastern Oklahoma, legally. That's not the case here, and that creates a very different sort of attitude and a different situation for them. And it's interesting, this is a global thing now too, because I've heard of land acknowledgements in Australia. And it's usually expected that an Indigenous person would be doing that, which is complicated.
Yeah, that's the first time I've heard it actually, was I was in Brisbane at an
Right.
international education conference.
Right.
And I was like, and it was like 2009.
Right.
And I thought, what is happening, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't an Indigenous person. So it was just all kind of a little bit weird.
Yeah, I think especially in the United States, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding among the general population about what a land acknowledgement is supposed to be.
Right.
And so I try to make a point, it's not a welcome.
Right.
It's much more of a like, what do you think gives you the right to be here kind of thing. But it needs to be a conversation. It needs to be something that can start a conversation. And that's really all it can do. And if it's not doing that, then it's just a trite welcome. I think Australia and New Zealand have been especially ahead of the game with land acknowledgements. But then it's also still an issue. But there's a lot less political resistance in Australia to say this. I could go, but yeah, I totally agree, and I hope if I do this enough for the rest of my life, I'm gonna do that. Did you have another question?
Oh, I was just wondering how the departments are receiving when you are going out to. Departments.
But most are pretty open and want to do something, want to participate, are happy to understand a little bit more what the point is. Especially once they do understand a little bit more what the point is, they're like, oh, that's what it's for, okay. But then I've also been told by, UGA is a massive thing. I won't mention any departments in particular, but I was told by the head of one department is like, well, we just can't do that. We were told we couldn't do a land. Nobody told them they just didn't want to deal with it. Like it's a lot of work, but we've done the work. We just want departments to adopt it If we can get all the departments at UGA to adopt it, or even all the departments in the humanities, because they haven't all adopted it, then we have some leverage maybe to get the universities to officially adopt. But I see, you know, if that happens in 5 years, I will be surprised. If it happens in 10 years, I would be happy. And I would also probably be probably. But I do think this is really important. I think it's important to understand. I think it's important work for institutions to do. Because we are in the first real generation of Native peoples living lives the way they want to. And if we want to genuinely be inclusive institutions, we need to acknowledge the history of damage that has been done to Indigenous peoples. And so that's why I'm doing it.
I think we have time for one more very quick question.
And there is one in the chat. So UGA, the Land Grant University in Woodward College, mention of how does or should this history of land grant take forward?
We decided when we were working on this, that if we just were aware and knew, you know, what a land grant institution means, you know, that we didn't need to directly address the land grant institution issue. Because the way that the land comes to be granted to UGA is the same, is part of this exact same process. So as long as we talk about the historical process, we're talking about the history of land grant institutions. So we didn't directly address that in much of our conversation. But you know, the way that I think there are 2 other colleges that were sort of founded as an extension of UGA that became independent institutions. And it's the same process. Dahlonega is a little distinct because it is the Gulf region. One of the reasons I wanted to come do this talk is because I've actually done quite a bit of research on the gold rush and what it meant for people in LJ especially. And so that history to me does all the work that we would do if we were digging into the land grant. And also all of my historical research was support. That was another reason. But digging directly into the land grant institution issues is a whole other set of political history and educational issues that I felt were sort of the committee, not just me, felt was sort of leading us off of the point. Not to say that that's not important in history to acknowledge. But that's good. Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.